here's our agenda. This is what we were going to cover today. So first I'm going to just offer a little bit of background on Story Center and what our organization is all about. And then I will talk a little bit about our unique digital storytelling methodology, which we've been really refining and working with for the past 20 years now. And we'll talk specifically on its use for NGOs. And then we'll look at a couple of interesting case studies from the Silent Speaks project that I mentioned, one focused on Asian and Pacific Islander women's rights and one focused on Indigenous rights and environmental issues. And then finally, we will share some simple storytelling and tech tips to get you started in thinking more about storytelling in your organization. And then hopefully at the end we'll have a little bit of time for some questions. So hopefully that all sounds good. So I'm just going to jump right in since we're a tad behind. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do actually is watch a story. So Jed, you actually have the links, and so if you want to copy and paste those links into the chat box, that would be great.
Okay, give me a moment.
So it's the very first one that says slide 2.
Yeah, you can see actually my screen, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay.
You can see your to-do list, but that's okay.
Okay, I think I've just
Sorry, I can't do it.
Sent this now, and all good.
All right.
Whoops.
So if people can just take a moment to click on that link in the chat box and watch the story, we'll start again in about 3 minutes from now. All right, so I think we can go ahead and continue on. Hopefully people had a chance to see that story. Just as a little bit of background on that piece. Now I'm trying to advance the slides again, and I am not able to. There we go. So that story was actually created in a collaboration with an NGO called the Afghan Women's Writing Project. And the digital storytelling workshop that I did with them was conducted entirely online, which isn't actually the way that we usually work. But for that particular project, just because of funding constraints and security issues, a decision was made to use pre-recorded webinar sessions and email and Skype sessions to do the whole workshop. And we're really happy with the way that it turned out. I'm going to give a bit of background, and first I do want to just mention that this webinar is really framed as a very introductory webinar. So there will be some, tips and information, but it's primarily just intended as really basic introduction and overview to this idea of digital storytelling, and then hopefully if people enjoy it and are interested, maybe we can go on and do some more slightly in-depth sessions on techniques and things like that. So just to give a little bit of background about Story Center. As I said, we've been around for about 20 years now. As far as we know, our founding director, Joe Lambert, coined the term digital storytelling way back in about 1991. And as people are probably aware, this term is really used to refer to a wide variety of media production methods and practices or different approaches to making media. But for our purposes at Story Center, digital storytelling is a community-based participatory process that brings small groups of people together in a workshop environment over the course of several days to verbally share stories from their own life experience, work with facilitators to really develop those stories into scripts, and then audio record them, select and produce images to illustrate the stories, and then learn themselves through simple computer tutorials how to actually edit these materials into short videos like the one that we just watched. And so the workshops lead not only to the production of videos, but also to the creation, of course, of text stories and that can be illustrated with photos, and also audio stories for community radio broadcast. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the idea of participatory media, it's really a way to shift the control of media content and production away from sort of professionalized experts and directly into community settings to prioritize the voices and perspectives of local community members and build their skills for actually producing and sharing media. So that's just a bit of background about us. We do have a really long history of collaborative work with different organizations around the world, and we've trained thousands of people from all walks of life in lots of varied cultural and linguistic contexts, speaking hundreds of different languages. And we always work directly with local partners, so local NGOs and grassroots groups, to ensure cultural responsiveness and build trust at the community level. And then the last point, I think this is already clear, but our practices are really highly accessible. So rather than sending trained filmmakers into a community to sort of collect a bunch of material and then allowing the professionals to make the decisions about the content and how stories are put together, we collaborate directly with community members on story content and the production steps. All right, so just a little bit continuing with the background in terms of the kind of the rationale for why storytelling and stories can be so valuable in an NGO context. There has been quite a bit of research over, I'd say probably the last 20 or 30 years, looking at different forms of storytelling and story sharing, and it really shows that telling and listening to stories can do a bunch of things. The first one listed here that relates to self-esteem and sort of health and well-being. And so the research really shows that telling and listening to stories can increase people's sense of self-efficacy, which is a belief that they have agency and are capable of handling life's challenges. And in our work, we've seen again and again that the kinds of stories that people tell in first-person voice, in an I voice, can really create a sense of intimacy that engages viewers directly. And so stories touch hearts in a way that, you know, more third-person reporting perspectives or lots of facts and figures just don't. The second piece I'm bringing up here is around literacy and writing skills. The research also shows that storytelling is just a really wonderful way to boost these skills. And people have used our methods extensively in K through 12 and adult education and higher ed settings to really build people's confidence in as storytellers and writers. So, you know, really what better way to teach literacy than by engaging people in talking and writing about their own lives. And the next piece I'm going to bring up is around organizational health, which I think is kind of germane to the NGO sector. And our work around in the area of organizational development really backs up research that suggests that storytelling is a great way to enhance the health of organizations and institutions in terms of enabling colleagues to share and connect and find common purpose in their work by getting clear about their values and their hopes and how these have been formed and shaped and how they relate to an organization's mission. And then finally, the last couple of points. The sharing and listening of stories have really been shown to both help members of communities bond with one another and build solidarity among groups, and also to kind of spur and motivate people's desires and involvement in change-making activities. And a great example of this, which I don't have as a link on the slide, but I can certainly circulate, is a recent project we did with an NGO called Grassroots Soccer in South Africa, which uses the power of soccer to support teaching about adolescent sexual and reproductive health and justice issues. And we did a project with them that was framed as a research study of what the role of digital storytelling in being able to support young women's involvement in community change. And her research really showed that participating in digital storytelling can improve relationships among young women peer groups and mobilize them to take part in community building and community mobilization efforts. So those are just kind of a few little pieces of rationale for why storytelling can be so valuable for NGOs. In terms of digital storytelling methods, I wanted to just very quickly go through the basics of a typical digital storytelling workshop. So first of all, I put down there at the bottom typical lengths of times and sort of numbers of people and facilitators. Typically we'll begin like any workshop or training with introductions and kind of icebreaker activities. And then we have a original curriculum piece called the 7 Steps of Digital Storytelling, which outlines for people some kind of key tips and ideas about what can be effective ways of crafting a story and developing it as a video. And then we do kind of the heart of the workshop, which is called the story circle. I'm sure that many of you in the audience have used similar techniques or methods with community members, but it's essentially literally bringing people into a circle and having them one at a time share their story idea verbally with each other. And it's a time really for the participants to bond and connect and offer feedback and support to each other, which kind of feeds into the script development process. And then once the scripts have been developed, we do audio recording. It's actually more like recording for radio. We don't typically record with video cameras because in our work, because we do so much community level work around often sensitive or stigmatized topics. We find that people are much more comfortable just speaking into a microphone rather than having a camera in their face. Then we support people in collecting existing images that they might possess, and in taking photos and video clips to use to illustrate their stories. And then we walk people through a very simple hands-on editing tutorial. So the participants themselves get to learn skills for video editing and put their work together. And then finally, we always end with a story screening and kind of a celebration and some kind of closure to bring everything to a close and send people off with whatever the next steps for a project might be. So that's a really typical agenda for the workshop. So I want to turn now just for people who might be interested in theory and sort of more theoretical perspectives, to some of the theories and methods that support the health and development and social justice work, which all sits within Story Center's Silent Speaks initiative. And so the first piece I wanted to point to is this idea of testimonio, which people might not be familiar with. It's essentially a practice that has its origins in human rights struggles in Latin America, of allowing people to stand and give testimony about their lives. And this, even though there has been a lot of controversy about the use of testimonial practices in terms of ideas of truth and validity, this practice has been really, really essential to our work overseas because of its emphasis on first-person voice, oral storytelling, and just the ways that individual and collective experience are reflected. And so when language differences factor into our work, we don't typically do script writing. We actually use other methods of capturing and clarifying what people say verbally. So the next quick theory that maybe people are familiar with is popular education. The pedagogy of Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, who really believed that people needed to develop what he called critical consciousness, or go through a process of what he called conscientization, which was a way of basically getting clear on the relationship of how one's own personal experience sits in a bigger political and social and cultural context. And he saw this really as a necessary step towards action for social change. And so in our workshops, we really sort of guide people through this type of process of talking about their own experience and then identifying how it connects to larger social and cultural and political structures and systems. And then the next piece is the culture-centered approach, and I'm not going to really say much about this because people can maybe look at the link later, and I want to get through all the more practical content, but essentially this is a theory that really believes that community-based, anyone who's doing community-based communication practices really must engage in participatory kinds of work and work directly with community members to co-construct meaningful stories and narratives that kind of that stand in opposition to more mainstream or dominant narratives that might be oppressive or contribute to human rights violations or contribute to poor health, that kind of thing. And then the last piece here is around practices in psychology. And our decades of work have really shown again and again just the immense value of creative process for integrating painful or stigmatized life experiences, as well as for the development of healthier identities and the encouragement of more healthy individual behaviors. So I think especially for our work in a wide range of cultural contexts, these pieces have been really important, especially where more traditional approaches to Western psychology might seem strange or just sort of inappropriate. All right, so moving on to the direct value of this kind of work for NGOs. I wanted to, so over the years, as we've been working more and more with NGOs on health and community development issues, we, really together with our partners, have come up with some really creative approaches to sharing stories for education and advocacy. And this model that I'm going to go over now is really loosely based on what's called the social ecological model of change in public health, but it also reflects some of the main ideas behind what is known as social and behavior change communication, or SBCC, which is an approach really widely used in international public health in terms of communication. So I'll go over this little funny looking diagram one at a time, and it occurs to me it actually looks like this little piece of math homework that my daughter does in her school. Fascinating. So the first light blue circle over there on the left looks at the impact on storytellers themselves of participating in a workshop like the one that I described. And so, you know, so the focus that we have on first-person storytelling really recognizes that people at the grassroots level often lack opportunities to share and bear witness to stories of their own struggles and successes, or to listen to stories of others. And so the workshops that we do really offer a safe and supportive environment in which people of all, really from their teens to elders, can explore their histories, reflect on how they got to where they are, and talk about issues that are important to them and to their communities. And so you know, this reflective aspect of story sharing helps people better understand their current interests and motivations, and also just gives a really amazing platform from which to develop their skills as community leaders and advocates on a whole bunch of different issues. So simultaneous to the process of developing stories, there's a really strong piece of leadership development that happens in the workshop process that can be quite valuable for NGOs that are doing community engagement work. The next piece, the darker blue circle, really looks primarily also at individual level change, but it frames change as a result of watching digital stories. So most of the NGOs that we work with have very explicit goals around how stories will be shared publicly and why they will be shared publicly. And what they have found, and what we've found, is that personal stories can be immensely useful tools to support the transmission of information, health information, for instance, and other desired forms of information about issues, as well as desired skills and behaviors. And the digital stories that come out of our workshops they really stand out for their ability to convey nuances of language and culture that can speak to specific audiences. And so what our partners have found is that when people see and hear a story that addresses a particular topic, their own conception as an audience member of what they might say or do can shift. And so this is where more broad-based behavior change can start. So the next circle, moving down, the brown one, expands out to look at how sharing stories can really generate and support community-wide change. And so our work with various partners has really shown that with skillful planning and facilitation, community story screenings can result in really deep and strategic discussions about relevant health and social issues, and really serve as the screening can serve as an opportunity to kind of map out local strategies for how audience members can mobilize and take action on issues. And this kind of in-person screening activity can be supported by distributing stories online in areas where connectivity is adequate, distributing stories via social media or mobile technologies, distributing stories through print methods on printed brochures or posters or bus shelters, and also sharing stories on local radio. And the research in social and behavior change communication shows that when people have multiple exposure to a similar story or narrative, that's when the biggest impact happens. So that's one of the nice things about digital storytelling, is that it is truly multimedia. It results in the production of these media pieces that can go out through different channels. And then the last piece here looks at the policy level. So I don't know if any of the NGOs are involved with policy work, those of you in the audience, but the stories, digital stories, can really bring the concerns of people who are typically overlooked into a policy setting. And this is whether one is talking about public policy, as in legislation or laws at the local or provincial or national level, or whether one is talking about institutional policies, for instance, of health organizations or schools or other civic or community groups. And so I think, you know, making sure that videos are seen by the right audiences of decision makers and policy makers is really key here. And then also just to say, we don't necessarily limit our policy focus to the idea of, you know, pushing for new needed policies. We found that stories can be really useful as a way of informing members of the public about particular laws that have been enacted, and that stories can contribute to training those responsible for policy enforcement to keep them accountable for their role. And then just to be clear before I go on to our first case study, these circles, they kind of go in order from left to right, but there's also a lot of overlap amongst them, as I'm sure people will agree and understand. All right, so turning to our first case study, I've been talking a lot. I'm really sorry for that, because I'm not the most interesting piece of the webinar. I think really the stories speak for themselves. So, so we're going to go on to talk about our ongoing collaboration with Asian Women's Shelter. And so let's start, if Jed, if you wouldn't mind now copying and pasting the second YouTube URL into the chat box. And then everyone can please just click on the link and watch the story that will come up in a new tab in your browser. And if people could please feel free to comment with reactions in the chat box, this will let us know exactly when we can move on.
Okay, you might check now the chat box. The link is there. So just please feel free to watch it for now. And just once you're done, just send me a note that it's all good so we can proceed with the webinar.
All right. I think that probably most people are done watching the video. So I'm going to go ahead and continue, especially because it has subtitles. So people might be just reading the subtitles. And I'm going to talk about this pretty quickly because I really want to make sure that we have time to cover the storytelling and tech tips. So there's lots more information that people can find out about this particular work on our website, and certainly just follow up with me. And so, but basically this piece was created as part of our ongoing collaboration with Asian Women's Shelter. And so beginning about 8 years ago, we have led a series of workshops with staff of their agency and of other agencies serving Asian and Pacific Islander communities focused on gender equality and gender-based violence. And given the sensitivity of these kinds of stories, I think people can see with that piece, one thing that's really great about our digital storytelling method is that people can remain fairly confidential and anonymous. So while that is the actual voice of the storyteller, we never actually see her image. And so there are many instances where people feel more comfortable staying anonymous. But given the sensitivity of these kinds of stories, we've really worked with AWS to create an approach that kind of recognizes the special considerations for working with survivors and witnesses and advocates. And so we allow extra time to fully process potentially difficult stories. So we'll typically do slightly longer workshops. And we really emphasize a strength-based approach, which enables the storytellers to kind of look at their painful experiences, but it emphasizes the idea of developing a story from a position of present-day strength and safety. And then, of course, we have very solid screening practices to make sure that participants are really ready to participate in this kind of workshop. And one thing that we've found is that the story circle process can be a really wonderful method for guiding support groups. And then Asian Women's Shelter, in terms of how they share the stories, they use them widely in their various trainings for service providers, police, and criminal justice personnel on issues facing women who've experienced gender-based violence. And I'm trying now, Jed, to, again, to advance the slide. There we go. So, so people, let me just go back to that. So those are some of the key points there, and as people get the slides, if they're more interested, they can look into the case study and the trauma, look at the information about trauma-sensitive digital storytelling. And then I'd like to continue on now to the second case study. And again, Jed is going to paste one more story, and we'll look at that.
Okay, hang on, guys.
Piece, because it's such a beautiful piece. So the piece that he's typing in, pasting in now to the chat box was created as part of a 3-year collaboration with the Christensen Fund, which supports the protection of Indigenous rights and biodiversity, or protection of the human world and the natural world.
Okay.
So go ahead and watch that story, and then we'll start again in about 3 minutes. All right, so I think most people should be just about finished, and I'm gonna just kind of speed through this so we can get to the next piece and still have time for questions, recognizing that we started a tad late. So this beautiful story that you just hopefully were able to watch was created in a 4-day workshop, storytelling and participatory media workshop in Tajikistan. And we collaborated quite closely with the Christensen Fund's local technical assistance partners to really build their skills for storytelling and media production, along with the skills of the storytellers. And because people traveled quite a distance to attend the workshop in Dushanbe, we worked closely with these technical assistance folks on providing guidance to the storytellers about what kinds of visual materials to bring. So for instance, some of the video footage and photos that Musayor brought to the workshop. And the stories are being shared as part of communication to bring visibility to the issues that Christensen funds, and to really engage the members of local communities in their work. And just to highlight a couple of points, So first, as probably has been clear from the stories that I've shown, we always really emphasize the importance of working in local languages and with local partners, and particularly in terms of the issues that Christensen addresses around Indigenous rights, it was really necessary to support people in creating stories in their mother tongues rather than doing English language voiceovers. And then secondly, in terms of how stories are shared, if you think back to that funny looking little chart with the circles that I went over, one way of really boosting the impact of the development of strategies for sharing stories is to engage the storytellers directly in deciding how and where and when and why their stories will be shared. And this was part of, actually part of the workshop in Tajikistan, we worked with the storytellers to identify local opportunities for sharing the stories. And they presented some really unique and locally appropriate ways to distribute stories. And just one example was that they are including them as part of these traditional hashar gatherings, which is a community gathering bringing local residents together to decide on community volunteer projects, mostly focused on environmental preservation. So that's just a beautiful example of how powerful it can be to work directly with the storytellers on figuring out how stories can be shared in local contexts for local benefits, rather than just simply thinking of stories as, oh, let's put these stories up on the web. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And again, recognizing that this is an introductory webinar, short of leading an entire digital storytelling workshop online, which we don't have time for today, I wanted to just offer a few simple tips that hopefully you can take away from the webinar and think about. So the first is our methods emphasize first-person voice. Obviously, people have heard in the stories that I've shared, but really there are many ways to tell stories, and I think it's just very important to be clear about your purpose and audience above all, and to let this drive and inform your approach to storytelling. We have found in our work with NGOs that first-person voice can be really useful, as we've seen during the webinar, but there are times also when NGOs might want to use use a third-person perspective to talk about issues in communities for a more formal kind of setting. The digital stories come off as very informal and very personable. They're definitely not a TED Talk. They're not a speech. They're not a bio. They're really just anecdotes and experiences. So the second point is there are many ways to make stories like the ones that I've shared. And as I think has been clear in the webinar, at Story Center, we really emphasize the value of participatory methods. And I would just encourage everyone to think about the benefits, but also be realistic about what's possible. using participatory methods does require a level of time and resources that can be challenging. And so for folks interested in this, I really urge you to reach out to practitioners. Please feel free to contact me about best practices for engaging community members on sharing and shaping stories and involving them in production. And actually at our organization we have an excellent set of ethics guidelines that directs all of our work, and I'm happy to share a link to that. All right, make sure you're well prepared. The third point around storytelling and story content is that we really urge NGOs to not sensationalize issues. And we've found that the benefit of working with personal stories over using more traditional journalistic or news production kind of methods is that the contents of what you're producing can be more subtle and honest, rather than the kind of in-your-face or shocking content of a lot of online media these days. And so we just caution folks against over-dramatizing issues or unnecessarily overplaying the portrayal of tragedy and pain without showing the strength of people in their communities. And I'm sure that all of you are on board with that as NGOs. I just kind of wanted to point it out because I think, you know, we live in a culture that spreads around a lot of really violent and gratuitous and content that doesn't allow people to kind of speak and represent themselves. And so just the view that everyone deserves dignity and humanity and that people's suffering shouldn't be used as a way to bring attention to social problems or raise funds and that kind of thing. All right, so the next piece in terms of actual structure of stories. So we, as I mentioned earlier, our digital storytelling approach includes an overview of what we call the 7 steps of digital storytelling. And unfortunately, we don't have time to introduce and review all of these, maybe in a future webinar if people are interested. But I wanted to just highlight a couple. And so, we in our work we put a lot of emphasis on this idea of finding and closely describing specific moments and scenes, and basically supporting storytellers in using a lot of details and dialogue to really bring audiences into their stories, and doing this by telling pieces of their story that only they can tell. And these are the kinds of things that differentiate stories from biographies or just a timeline of events in someone's lives. You know, a story can have a kind of narrative arc with a setup, a middle, and a conclusion in a way that just a bio of, you know, I'm so-and-so from here, this is what I've done, that's like more just a list of accomplishments and achievements, doesn't have that kind of narrative arc. So we would encourage people in thinking about stories to think anecdotally about particular moments in time that can be brought out. And then, and also, of course, to be concise. And this is especially if you do want to prepare stories that will be shown or used online, people's attention spans are pretty short for online content unless they're really committing to watch that 30-minute documentary. So being concise and, you know, working with 2 to 3 minute stories can be really useful. And the same is true for developing content for training contexts, that often your time as an NGO to do training is quite short, so you can't show a whole film, but digital stories with their short time frame are really ideal. And then finally, in terms of storytelling tips, we really urge the use, again, like I said before, of details that only the storyteller would be able to know and be able to share. And so I don't know if people have heard this idea of showing and not telling with a story. And so for us at Story Center, what this means in terms of emotional content is that instead of, okay, I'm going to go back. Instead of just listing off feelings like I felt sad or tired or hopeless, which is, you know, really telling an audience how to feel, just describe what happened. Where were you? What did the room look like? What did you smell? and hear. And so these kinds of details enable audiences to have their own emotional response and can really build a connection between a storyteller and a listener. All right, so moving on to some tech tips. Again, we don't have a lot of time to share tons of information, but just to help people start to think about what might be possible within their organization. The first, I would just recommend, if this is a brand new kind of idea for your organization, to just start small and simple. Storytelling can be an incredibly valuable activity, even if you don't actually produce any media or videos or anything. So think about weaving story circles or storytelling or reflective story writing into your staff development and training activities and directly into your work with local communities. And this is a great way to build internal capacity and lead up to working with actual media production. So the second piece is probably pretty obvious, but if you're wanting to pursue a media production approach and your budget is really limited to non-existent, which I know is often the case for NGOs and is usually the case for us as an NGO, be sure to use the technology resources you already have in-house. So many people have smartphones that can accommodate great apps for voice recording and scanning and photography and videography. And most, if not all, laptops come with simple video editing applications. And I would suggest, if this is something you're interested in, think about forming an internal digital storytelling team and explore and pool your existing resources and come up with a plan for building your team's skills internally. And then third, and I say this with a bit of caution because I think it's very crucial to do your homework and explore the techniques and the ethics of local media groups and partners. Once you have experimented with what you can do on your own, you might think about collaborating with local groups. If you have a really solid understanding of what it takes to do an ethically sound and high-quality storytelling and participatory project, you'll be a lot better able to communicate with local media producers about exactly what you want to do and what you want your respective roles to be and what resources you have to work with. So fourth, do your research on available software and apps, and there are so many nowadays that I didn't want to really pick out specific recommendations when we're talking with big groups of diverse NGOs like this audience for the webinar. We hesitate to make specific recommendations because the needs of each organization can be so different. But we're really happy to offer consultation to individual agencies once we know what you're hoping to do. So feel free to reach out. But the link here is it goes to a great overview of a whole bunch of excellent apps that can help with media production, with photography, scanning, shooting video, voice recording, and editing. And so I would say, really take your time with your internal team or a few colleagues to look into what's out there, what's most user-friendly, and what's accessible and affordable, if not free. And then finally, this is probably the most important point. As I think I already said this with the storytelling tips, but take the time to be really clear about why you want to create media before you jump in. So deciding what specific kinds of impacts you want to have at the local community level, at the organizational level, at the country level, etc. These decisions will really need to drive your choices about what methods and forms of media to produce. So, for instance, if internet connectivity is an issue in communities that you're trying to reach, obviously creating media for distribution online isn't going to be the best choice. So developing audio stories specifically for community radio broadcast might be more appropriate. And this, I'm sure this probably sounds really obvious to folks, but you'd be surprised how often people sort of just jump to, oh, let's create videos, and they don't quite think through what's going to be most useful and what's going to serve an organization's mission. All right, so I think that brings us to the end, and I know we're out of official time, but I didn't know, Jed, if you wanted to see if anyone had any questions that I could address in the next couple of minutes, or...
Hi, Amy. Yeah, actually, we've just run out of time, but yeah, let's just go through. I'm just gonna go through the questions here. All right, real quick. So okay, so there's one question here from Anthea. So what's the most effective way to share these stories or videos to reach your target audience?
That's a really great question. And I mean, I think it really depends on the audience. But you know, my general answer would be to really go for the multimedia approach. I think the agreement or consensus of marketing people now is to just get stories out on as many multiple platforms as you can. You know, I will say that with our Silent Speaks work, we really privilege the benefits of story viewing for local audiences. So we work with our partners on things like integrating story screenings into their programs that are doing community mobilization around gender-based violence, for instance. And so that would be actually organizing a screening in a community and, you know, showing videos. But at the same time, like I said, you can really reinforce those messages by also trying to collaborate with a community radio station locally to air the stories on radio, or develop a call-in radio show that plays stories and answers questions about them, for instance. So we have a really wonderful case study of story distribution as part of our work with Sonke Gender Justice in South Africa. And so, Jed, I'm happy to circulate that because it does give a really good overview to kind of multiple ways to distribute stories. So maybe that would be useful.
Yes, please. We can share that. We can share a link to that maybe on the
Okay.
post-webinar email. Yes. So okay, here's
Okay.
another. Okay, so here's another question from Antoinette. So, how can you catch the attention of people to have multiple exposure to digital stories?
So that's another great question about distribution. I mean, I think it's interesting people are bringing this up because I'm literally getting ready this weekend to work with the Hepatitis B Foundation to do a workshop focused on raising awareness of Hep B, which I know is an issue that disproportionately affects API communities. And so it'll be interesting to stay in touch with some of your audience and see what their response is to that campaign. But so what we're doing with that is we're distributing the stories and the story content in a variety of different ways, including online, including trying to get coverage in various news media, including partnering with language-specific radio outlets to get the stories out there, including posting the story narrative as blog postings together with photos, and then also using Facebook and probably other social media tools to get them out there. So, you know, as many different ways as you can think of to push content out, I think can be valuable with getting digital stories out too. Oh, and one other quick thing, with that project, we're creating 2 to 3 minute videos, but we also will be creating probably 30 to 60 second kind of mini PSA versions. So we're going to kind of work with the whole story to just pull out a very short piece that is very message focused, and that, you know, so we've determined the key messages, which are, you know, get tested and get treated, and also a message around destigmatizing Hep B. So, yeah, hopefully that was, yeah.
Yeah, actually, adding to that, Amy, we actually have tested around 60-second videos as well. So, you know, as technology is a very intimidating topic for a lot of people, what we did was instead of kind of like blabbering a lot on a blog, how about we make a 60-second quick video on explaining what cloud technology is, what's the difference between these two products. It's actually very helpful, and yeah, and I actually agree with your idea there that it should be very message focused, and creating a concise setup where it should be done in 60 seconds. That actually really helps drive the main point of a story. So yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And then, you know, with the digital stories, you can sort of pull out the main piece, and then if people are really drawn in and interested, then you can link them to the whole story, you know, hear more about so-and-so's story, that kind of thing.
All right. So okay, we have a series of very interesting questions here. So here's one from Michael. So
Okay.
he's a filmmaker, and he's actually had experience in doing third-person voice acting and talking heads
Oh, great.
narrative. Yeah. So he's just interested on is there a manual or any material that would give me an overview or step-by-step procedures in going about the participatory approach in storytelling?
Sure. Okay, so participatory media is kind of a larger or more broad umbrella term that's used to describe a variety of approaches. With the main common element is, directly engages direct methods that directly engage the subjects of the media in production. So many participatory video processes actually bring communities together to kind of develop scripts and act in them and film them, but they don't actually engage people in the technical aspects of production. And what's different about our process is that we, do guide people step by step through producing their own video. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a few different ways of doing participatory media. So if you're interested specifically in the method that I've described, you might look at getting a copy of our digital storytelling cookbook, or I would highly recommend the book that has been the book by our founding director, Joe Lambert. I believe it's called Digital Storytelling, Creating Community, or something like this. And you can find information on our website about how to get a hold of it. But it's a really great. Both of those are great resources.
All right. So just following up, there's another question as well from Tran. Can you give an example about effective use of participatory approach?
Well, I can give lots of examples of, lots of different examples from specific projects, but I'm not really sure if the effective is supposed to be about the effect on the storytellers or effective in terms of creating useful stories that can be shared. So I guess I can speak to both. Probably the most recent study that really shows the benefits of using a participatory approach, such as the one that we use, is the work that I mentioned very early on in the webinar, a collaboration with Grassroots Soccer in South Africa. And so that project was framed as a study looking at what the benefits are for young women of participating in participatory media, meaning digital storytelling. And some really concrete results did come out in terms of them having improved self-concept, greater, more developed relationships and kind of a connection with each other, and greater intention and desire to get involved with community building efforts. And so that's a really great study if you're looking for information on the rationale for why your organization should do this. And again, I can send a link to that around, send it to Jed, and then we can include it in the follow-up. I think that would be great.
All right, cool. Okay, so couple last questions. The first is, how do you go about recruiting storytellers given the sensitivity of the topics usually tackled?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and that's the type of thing that I would love, if we're able to maybe do some more in-depth follow-up kinds of webinars. That's a type of thing that we could discuss. The quick answer is, in the materials that I'll send to Jed, I'll include a link to our ethics guidelines, which is kind of overview to ethical practice. But with the storytellers, so as I said, we always work in close partnership with organizations, and so that means that we really rely on the connections and expertise that our partner organizations have with local communities, and we design outreach and recruitment strategies in collaboration with our partner agencies, because they know best what the various issues are and what the sensitivities are, and how we can best reach people. So just to give a quick example of how we have worked with the Hepatitis B Foundation here in the States, we did kind of a multi-tier outreach and recruitment process where we developed a printable and online kind of, not really an application, but sort of an expression of interest, which the foundation circulated to all of its local partners in health organizations and health departments. And so people were able to complete that, and then we were able to look at that. But I think more specifically to what you're talking about with sensitive issues, one thing that's really critical is that in our organization, we don't actually, we would not take the position that digital storytelling is an appropriate method for use with people who are currently experiencing a lot of symptoms of post-traumatic stress or have very recently experienced trauma, unless it's combined with some pretty intensive intervention and support for people. So there's a whole, I think I mentioned it earlier in the webinar, but we have a whole piece on digital storytelling and trauma that talks about some of the benefits and then things to, you know, cautionary notes of things to look out for that could be challenging. It's really important to have screening tools so that you can help people assess for themselves and, you know, assess them of whether they're ready. So this is all a lot of information I'm putting out there. I would say that if you're interested in more, it might be useful just to email me and we can dialogue online.
All right, cool. Okay, and last question, Amy, is do you make efforts to get audience feedback on the digital stories? And if yes, how do you do that?
That's another great question, which I really appreciate. And I had started to put in a slide in the presentation that was, you know, kind of looking at impacts and research that has been done, but there just wasn't enough room, obviously, because we're going over time now. But again, that would be a great topic for some follow-up. And I can share a link to a page that describes some of the research that's being done. The short answer is it, you know, sort of depends on resources. So with our programs, we do have some partnerships with researchers where they're actually doing some pretty formal research studies of the impact of watching stories, and that's all too much to go into in this amount of time. But I think that, you know, for NGOs and groups like that, there are some simple things that you can do to capture responses in local settings. And a super simple one is when people come into a screening, give them a Post-it note and or a little set of Post-it notes and have them write one-sentence comments or something on a Post-it note to really capture their emotional response. Other things too is, you know, we have examples of surveys that people have developed and handed out at community screenings. Our partners at the Banyan Tree Project, the Asian and Pacific Islander Wellness Center project focused on HIV stigma in Asian Pacific Islander communities, they've done things like offer people a gift certificate if they will participate in an online survey after viewing digital stories. So again, if people are interested in hearing more about any of those strategies, I think just feel free to reach out to me.
Okay, and yeah, I think that's about the last question. So, and since we're already going over time, so I think we should, this is about it. So, Amy, again, thank you very, very much for doing this and for spending some time with us NGOs. And yes, and I'll just be waiting for your links and we'll be sending that as part of the post-webinar email. And for those that are in attendance, please expect a post-webinar email from me within the next few days. That will include the links that Amy has said, has mentioned, the copy to the presentation, and of course the webinar recording. So again, Amy, thank you very much, and I would wish you a nice evening. If you have any last last messages, perhaps before we formally close it.
I think I better go see what my daughter's up to because it's gotten very quiet. I no longer hear the sound of SpongeBob SquarePants. So,
That's
yeah, it's time for bed over here in California. So I just thank everyone who signed on so much. I hope something has been useful here, and I really encourage people to reach out to find out more. And I hope we can figure out other ways of supporting your group.
Thank you very much, Amy, and everyone as well. Thank you, and yep, let's just keep in touch. All right.